Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Most of Canada is built for the car. In a lot of rural places, you simply need one to exist. And even in most cities, the car is just the default. And listen, on highways or major arteries, that's fine. You want to sit in traffic on the 401 or somewhere else, go for it. But when that traffic ends up flooding residential streets, turning neighborhoods into thoroughfares, that's when it gets ugly. And in some cases, dangerous for kids or cyclists or pedestrians. But you can't just close those streets to cars, can you? It'll kill local businesses. It'll jam more traffic elsewhere. It'll make commute times longer. It won't work. Or maybe it will. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Toula Drimonis is a writer and journalist based in Montreal, where city planning has taken an unusual shift. Hello, Toula.
Hi, Jordan. How are you?
I'm doing well. This is a good news story, I guess, and we don't get many of those on this show, so thank you for joining us.
Right. Thank you for having me. And just to make it clear, the car is not vanishing.
No, I know.
It is not going anywhere. But yes, there definitely are certain improvements that have taken place in the city.
That's exactly why we wanted to talk to you, just because of how Montreal has transformed, I guess, over the past decade plus. And maybe you can just tell us how it started. Who's Luc Ferrandez and what did he want to do?
Luc Ferrandez was a mayor for a specific borough in Montreal, Montreal, which is in kind of central Montreal. And he was a mayor of that particular borough from 2009 to 2019 when he resigned. And his main goal was to basically improve the quality of life for that particular neighborhood. He came into power. He realized that there were a lot of issues with safety, with far too many cars in the area, a lot of traffic, a lot of through traffic. And he really took it on as one of his main goals, not just for environmental reasons, but also for safety reasons, to not eliminate, but to decrease the presence of cars in that area, to work towards increased pedestrianization, making the area safer. He eliminated roadways through parks. He created a lot more urban spaces where people could gather that were safer, that were much prettier to look at, that were just an all-around kind of emphasis on people and not necessarily cars. And I'm really, for anyone who read my piece in the Walrus, I think it's clear that I am a fan of what he did and what he decided to focus on, because he really did. He was instrumental in changing that part of Montreal, and he was a forerunner for many things that were about to come.
And before we talk about exactly sort of how the culture began to shift and where it's led us now, maybe explain for those who aren't familiar with the city, 15, 20 years ago, I spent a lot of time in Montreal around then. What was Montreal like for pedestrians, especially in highly trafficked areas? Because I remember it as pretty terrifying.
I mean, it still can be in certain areas. Let's not kid ourselves. There are a lot of improvements that have taken place, but the car is still very much present everywhere, including Montreal. We still live in very car-centric cities, urban centers, where it's really hard. It's a real battle to kind of decrease that presence or this kind of car-centric mentality. But 10, 15 years ago, it was even worse. There were far too many pedestrian accidents or far too many cyclists being injured and people just trying to cross the street. That particular area that I mentioned, Montreal, where Ferrandez was mayor for about a decade, had the highest number of traffic-related accidents at the time. Things have steadily improved, although, in my opinion, not as drastically as I would like them to improve.
Well, this whole discussion is going to be about finding a balance, right? Because obviously, as you mentioned, I might joke about the car vanishing. It's not going away. But the way Montreal has chosen to combat that is really interesting. And, just briefly, you mentioned Ferrandez started with relatively small changes, closing roads through parks and stuff like that. What kind of reaction did that get when it happened?
One of the first things he did was to convert a two-way, about a 10-block stretch of Laurier Avenue to a one-way. And he reversed direction to on some streets to basically divert cars into more main thoroughfares, increased bike paths, installed like a lot of different traffic calming measures. And of course, it had the predictable reaction. A lot of people were complaining. There was a lot of pushback at the time. There were business owners on certain of these streets that were complaining, worried about that it would decrease business, that it would make it harder for their clients, the shoppers, to access the area. It would make it harder for delivery trucks to access the area. There was a considerable pushback, including from drivers who basically were upset that it would potentially create gridlock or increase their commute time. You know, even though many studies have shown that the increase in commute time because of these measures is quite minute. You know, like if you want to make a big deal out of a couple of extra minutes, sure, be my guest. But I think the benefits far outweigh some of these inconveniences. There was considerable pushback, and it still is to this day in many areas when some of these measures are implemented. But the end result always seems to kind of make believers of a lot of people. You know, like a lot of these measures are now seen as instrumental in revitalizing many of these particular neighborhoods and completely changing the quality of life, improving the quality of life for people. The thing that I love about Fernández the most, I have to say, and that I respect so much about his vision, was that he was extremely unapologetic about what his goals were. He made it very clear that it was about the quality of life for people who live there, not necessarily for the people who are commuting through the neighborhoods. And I think that's vital in changing the mentality of how we perceive urban living.
So in terms of getting the results, I know you mentioned, businesses were one of the main groups that were upset about these changes. We've seen that in other cities too. Do we have any data about the impact of pedestrianization like this on businesses?
Yes, absolutely. Despite the naysayers, the studies have shown consistently that there has been improvement, and a lot of these benefits are because of the pedestrianization of these streets. I'll give you an example. Mount Royal Avenue, which is probably Montreal's most famous pedestrianized street. Mm-hmm. This was a pilot project that started during the pandemic, 2020. The city decided that it wanted to help people, business owners on the street. People were suffering during the pandemic, but it also wanted to make sure that social distancing would take place. So it decided that it was going to shut down about 2 kilometers of Mount Royal, give or take. And it was so successful, the commercial vacancy plummeted. And I'll give you the stats. I wrote them down because I was afraid I would forget. From 14.5% in 2018 to 5.6% today. That is huge. That is huge. And similar things have been noticed as similar improvements on another street in Verdun called Wellington. There's been an increase in traffic, a considerable one. The street has changed completely. I can tell you that I'm someone who lives not too far away from that borough, and Wellington was never a destination point for me. I just kind of found it a little bit of a sad street. And now it is one of my favorite summer destinations when it shuts down to traffic. It is a place that is packed with bars and restaurants and people walking around and all this, whimsical kind of summer furniture where people can hang out on Fridays. There are usually hundreds of people that get together to dance salsa and bachata. It's really so much more pleasant. So yes, there are concrete benefits to pedestrianization, and these are, you can actually see them with numbers. And the proof is in the pudding because the city recently announced that they are increasing the budget for these pedestrianized streets because requests for them have been multiplying, not only from Montrealers, but from business owners themselves who realize that it actually benefits them in the long run.
Maybe can you explain how what was happening up in Plateau Montreal spread to the rest of the city and led to the creation of something called Projet Montréal?
Sure. A lot of these traffic calming measures that had already started to be implemented in the Plateau Montréal area expanded when Projet Montréal, the political party, came into power in 2017. And with Mayor Valérie Plante, it's kind of that vision of favoring pedestrianization and more bike paths and not. There are a lot of people who claim it's anti-car. I don't believe the party is anti-car at all. I think it is about finding that balance that you mentioned earlier, where people who live in the city can equally share in this public space. It's about reclaiming public space that often is taken over by cars. And Projet Montréal has made it part of its vision to do that. Over the years, in the last 8 years or so that they've been in power, they've increased the number of protected bike paths. They've increased green curb extensions. They have widened sidewalks. They have many more urban parks. And this is very much an extension of what started years ago in Projet Montréal. And it is about increasing safety, increasing the quality of life for many of us who don't necessarily favor cars. I am someone who used to be quite addicted to my car, and I changed that mentality. I decided that I wanted to spend a lot more time using public transit and using my bike. And I can tell you personally that the stress levels in my life have decreased drastically because I no longer use the car. And when people complain about congestion, it's not something that personally affects me. But I also understand, I'm realistic. I understand that there are a lot of people, because of their family situation or because of their work, absolutely need their car. But I think it's important to remember that all of these measures, all of these efforts that we do to improve public transit, to improve and make cycling or walking safer, have as a result reducing cars, which ultimately also benefits people who have no choice but to drive. It benefits everyone. It's a win-win, really.
Well, I was going to ask you, now that this program has expanded so much in the summer months, what happens to traffic on the streets that are not closed down? And I know Montreal is like an incredibly popular destination downtown, especially in the summer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that it does create congestion in certain side streets. And people do continue to complain when pedestrianized, like the summer streets, the car-free streets are implemented in the summer. But there are solutions, and people do need to become less reliant on their cars. There are options. People constantly complain about, lack of parking or lack of access to certain areas, yet are reticent to kind of choose options that are available to them. Like the city has implemented different options. There are lots where people can park their cars. There is access to these areas. There are certain streets that have implemented now these mini buses or options that they can take to access these areas for people who may have mobility issues. I'm not saying any option it's not perfect. There'll always be people who potentially complain or have this notion that they should be able to access any part of the city and immediately find free and easy access in front of, a particular business or their home. And I think that's a little unrealistic in densely populated urban areas that I don't think should prioritize cars. I think humans should be prioritized in urban settings. And I think it is about changing this mentality a little bit to understand that people who walk and people who take their bikes and people who use public transit are just as much tax-paying contributors to these roadways without necessarily creating any of the reasons for its upkeep and the maintenance. Like drivers will often complain and say, but I'm paying for the roads, and which is not true.
Right.
We all pay for them.
So far we've talked a lot about maybe not the tourist strips, but the commercial strips, the places where people go to party and that kind of stuff. The other aspect has been pedestrianization in very residential spaces. Can you kind of describe what that looks like?
Sure. I mean, a lot of these streets that I mentioned, like Wellington, for example, sure, it's commercial, but it's very residential as well. The same with Mount Royal. I mean, it's very residential as well. What I love about these car-free streets, not only that it increases business and it's good for the environment and it makes it safer for people to walk around, is this sense of community that it fosters. I've said this before and I've written many times on the topic. There is no way to truly appreciate your city if you're behind the wheel of a car from your windshield, looking out from a windshield. You need to actually access it. You need to be able to walk your neighborhood, to speak with your neighbors, to be able to sit down, have a cup of coffee or a drink, during 5 à 7 happy hour, and to be able to speak with the people who are around you. And I think these car-free streets manage to create the sense of community that is often missing from large urban streets and is so vital, so necessary for people to feel involved in their neighborhoods, and have a sense of belonging to their city. I think it's vital, and it does speak to that quality of life that Fernández was speaking about when he first was instrumental, or a part of the people who were instrumental in kind of changing this and being agents of change for this kind of notion.
So it's really interesting because, we see this as very unique to Canadian cities, which are in general extremely focused on the car. But how unique is this really globally? Like, what are we seeing in recent years in places across the world?
It's not unique at all. As I mentioned in my piece, Fernández had a blueprint to work from. I lived in Europe for 10 years. Europe has a very different mindset when it comes to a lot of these issues. It's fostered for many, many years, decades now, this kind of more human-centered communal culture, public socialization. It is, I mentioned in my article, Copenhagen's, Stroll Avenue, this area that eliminated cars, way back in the 60s. London's Carnaby Street went car-free in the 70s. Paris, has been working really hard at eliminating cars as much as possible, has created a bunch of pedestrian streets, banned cars in the city center. I think these are vital moves to make cities more livable and safer and just visually more interesting and to create this sense of community that I was mentioning earlier. It's not new. We've seen it even here in North America. New York has taken steps to do that. New York City. It's not new. And a lot of times people will say, but we're different and the climate is different in Canada. Sure, perhaps it doesn't allow for, year-round pedestrianization, but I do think that there is more balance that can be achieved and efforts that can be made to center people far more in our urban centers.
Last question. How do you spread this to other Canadian cities? Are people taking notice around the country?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's by doing these things and by, being bold, for politicians to be bold and making some of these moves, even though there will be blowback from people who are afraid or people who just want it to be a little more convenient for them to get around cars. I think a lot of these things that had pushback in the beginning, the pedestrianized streets or increasing bike paths, have proven their worth. Years later, we look back on them and we see that they are extremely popular with people, with Montrealers. We see that more and more areas are asking for more pedestrianized streets or more bike paths, and other cities are taking notice. I know for a fact that there are a lot of urban planners that come to Montreal, and every time they come here, they cannot stop raving about some of these things. They will talk about it, they will write about it, they will tweet about it. And people take notice, many urban planners across Canada have called it like political guts, that the Plante administration has made some of these changes. And we are seeing changes. There are cities in Canada as well that I think are slowly making these baby steps. Toronto, banned cars in High Park on the weekends. I think they're working towards more pedestrianized streets. Hamilton just announced that they are investing about $60 million in increasing the bike path network. Edmonton, Vancouver. I think it's by seeing that these things can actually happen and that it can actually be popular and enjoy public support and actually have concrete benefits for the people impacted in the area, like the businesses, that it creates this desire to also copy some of these steps.
Toula, thank you so much for this. Like I said, it's great to have a positive story.
Thank you for having me.
Toula Drimonis, writing in The Walrus. That was The Big Story. For more from us, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can, of course, always send us feedback by writing to hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling 416-935-5935 to leave us a voicemail. You can find this podcast in every single podcast player, including Seeker, Seekr. If you haven't checked it out yet, give it a try. And you can listen to it on your smart speaker by asking that speaker to play The Big Story podcast. Joe Fish is the lead producer of The Big Story. Robin Simon is also a producer here. Matt Kesselman is our sound designer. Stephanie Phillips is our showrunner. Mary Jubrin is our audience development lead. Diana Kay is our business manager, and I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings, your host and executive producer. Be on the lookout for a surprise this weekend, and we will be back on Monday.